The sun dipped low over the endless plains of Red Hollow, Nebraska, casting a warm amber glow across the patchwork of cattle ranches and sunburnt grass that stretched to the horizon. It was the summer of 2025, and the air carried the heavy scent of dust and hay mingling with the faint hum of cicadas in the fading light. For 17-year-old Sarah Jane Carter, the beauty of that evening was a distant thing, lost in a haze of dread that clung to her like a second skin. Her wrists burned the coarse rope biting into her flesh as it pressed her against the rough bark of an old cottonwood tree, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The laughter of her tormentors, Mason Reed and his loyal shadows, Tara and Bryce, echoed through the desolate field, sharp and cruel, cutting deeper than the ropes ever could. They had ambushed her on her walk home from the town library, their pickup truck screeching to a halt beside her, their hands rough and unyielding as they dragged her to this isolated spot half a mile from her family's struggling ranch. Sarah's heart pounded her breath shallow, her patched denim jacket offering little protection against the chill creeping into the air. She was alone, or so it seemed, her small frame trembling against the tree, her sneakers scuffing the dirt in futile resistance. But Sarah Jane Carter had a secret one she guarded even from her parents, one that made her more than the quiet ranch girl everyone underestimated. Tucked in the back pocket of her jeans was a satellite phone, a rugged little device she'd bought with months of saved chore money. And on that phone was a number she'd memorized but never dared to call until now. Her fingers scraped and shaking fumbled for it, the cold metal slipping twice before she caught it. The screen flickered to life, a faint glow in the gathering dusk, and with a trembling thumb, she dialed. The phone rang twice, 3 times, each tone stretching into eternity. Then a voice answered low and steady, slicing through the static like a lifeline. "Sarah, what's wrong?" It was him, Lieutenant Ethan Holt, her husband, a Navy SEAL, stationed on a classified mission thousands of miles away, a man Red Hollow had never met and never would have imagined tied to the shy girl in faded jeans. "Ethan?" She whispered, her voice cracking. "They tied me to a tree. I need you." Sarah Jane wasn't like the other kids in Red Hollow. She was quiet, almost invisible. Her long brown hair pulled into a loose braid that swung down her back like a lifeline to her childhood. Her family's ranch, a sprawling but faltering spread of cattle and weathered fences, was her world. She'd grown up mending barbed wire with her father feeding calves before dawn, and curling up with tattered paperbacks in the shade of the cottonwood tree that now held her captive. Her parents, Tom and Lila Carter, were hard-working, but worn, their faces etched with the strain of a ranch teetering on the edge of foreclosure. They loved Sarah, but their days were consumed by survival, leaving little time to notice the weight she carried beyond the chores. At Red Hollow High, Sarah's shyness was a beacon for cruelty. Her patched clothes, her soft-spoken answers in class, her habit of eating lunch alone with a book, they marked her as different, and different was a sin in a town where conformity was king. Mason Reed, the school's golden boy, ruled the halls with a quarterback's swagger and a smirk that could cut glass. His blue eyes sparkled with charm for teachers and cheerleaders, but for Sarah, they held a glint of malice. Tara, his girlfriend with her glossy ponytail and designer boots, followed his lead with a giggle that masked her own insecurities. Bryce Mason's best friend was quieter, his loyalty to Mason tinged with hesitation, but he never broke rank. The bullying had started small snickers in the hallways, whispers of cowgirl and loser hissed as she passed. Sarah kept her head down, her books clutched like a shield. But Mason had a talent for cruelty, and he'd set his sights on breaking her. It began in earnest that spring when Mason spotted Sarah reading alone during lunch. "Think you're too good for us, ranch girl," he'd called across the cafeteria, loud enough for every head to turn. Sarah's cheeks burned, her eyes tramped on the linoleum floor, her tray of lukewarm mac and cheese trembling in her hands. She didn't think she was better. She barely thought of herself at all. The taunts grew bolder, notes slipped into her locker with words like freak, scrawled in jagged ink. Her backpack accidentally knocked into the mud outside the school. Her name mocked in group chats that buzzed through the school like wildfire. Sarah endured it. Her silence, her only defense, but silence only fueled Mason's fire. By summer, the cruelty had escalated. One afternoon, as Sarah walked the dusty road home from the library, Mason's pickup truck roared past, slowing just enough for Tara to lean out and toss a soda can at her feet, the sticky liquid splashing her boots. "Keep walking." Nobody. Tara had laughed, and Mason's grin in the rearview mirror promised worse to come. Sarah ran her breath, hitching her braid, bouncing, but they were always there, their laughter a shadow she couldn't outrun. That was when Mason got the idea, the twisted, vicious idea that led to the cottonwood tree. It was a Friday evening, the air thick with the promise of rain, the sky bruised with clouds rolling in from the west. Sarah had been at the library, her backpack heavy with books on veterinary science. She dreamed of saving animals, maybe even the ranch one day. She was half a mile from home when the truck screeched to a halt beside her, kicking up dust that stung her eyes. Before she could react, Bryce was out grabbing her arms with a grip that bruised. Tara was there too, giggling as she pulled a coil of rope from the truck bed, her eyes bright with a cruel excitement. "Time to learn your place," Sarah Jane Mason said, stepping out of the driver's seat, his voice low and menacing. Sarah fought, kicking and twisting, but she was small, barely 5 feet tall, and they were strong. They dragged her across the field, her sneakers scraping furrows in the dirt, to the cottonwood tree that stood alone by the old Cutler Road, hidden from the highway by a curve in the land. The rope bit into her wrists as they tied her to the trunk, the bark rough against her back. Mason leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. "Let's see how long it takes for someone to care about you, cowgirl," he sneered. Then they were gone, their laughter fading into the dusk as the first drops of rain began to fall cold and heavy, soaking through her jacket. Sarah's chest tightened, panic clawing at her throat. The ropes were too tight, cutting into her skin, and every twist only made them bite deeper. The field was silent except for the rustle of grass and the distant rumble of thunder. She was alone, her parents oblivious, the town indifferent. Red Hollow wasn't a place where people noticed the quiet ones, not unless they were bleeding. But Sarah wasn't as helpless as she seemed. 2 years ago at a county rodeo, she'd met Ethan Holt, a 23-year-old Navy SEAL home on leave. He was broad-shouldered, quiet, with eyes that saw through her defenses to the dreams she kept hidden. They'd bonded over shared stories of starry nights and the smell of leather, their connection instant and unshakable. By the end of that summer, they'd married in a secret ceremony at a chapel just over the state line, a vow sealed with a promise to keep it hidden until Sarah was older. Ethan had shipped out the next day his letters, and rare calls her only tether to him. He was her secret, her strength, and now tied to this tree, he was her only hope. Her fingers fumbled for the satellite phone, the one she'd bought after months of saving, knowing Ethan's missions took him to places where regular phones didn't work. The rain was falling harder now, the screen slick under her trembling fingers. She dialed, her heart hammering as the phone rang. When Ethan's voice answered, it was like a crack of light in the dark. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he said, his tone sharp with concern. She could barely speak, her voice a whisper. "Ethan, They tied me to a tree. Mason and his friends. I'm on Cutler Road by the cottonwood. I'm scared. There was a pause, a faint rustle of movement on his end, and then his voice came back hard as steel. Stay calm, Sarah. I'm coming. Exact location, now. She told him her words, stumbling, and he didn't hesitate. I'm on a transport in 2 hours. Don't hang up. Keep talking to me, the line stayed open. His voice a steady anchor as she heard him barking orders in the background, his team mobilizing with the precision of men trained for war. Sarah clung to the phone, the rain soaking her to the bone. Her wrists aching, but Ethan's voice kept her grounded. She didn't know how he'd get there or how long it would take. But she knew one thing: Ethan Holt never broke a promise. As the storm gathered overhead, Sarah's mind raced. She thought of her parents who'd be wondering why she wasn't home yet, and of Mason who'd never faced a consequence in his life. Anger flickered in her chest, a spark of defiance she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just a victim. She was Sarah Jane Carter, wife of a Navy SEAL, and she would survive this. The rain fell harder, the thunder closer, but she held the phone tight. Ethan's voice, a lifeline in the dark. I'm here, Sarah, he said, his words cutting through the static. I'm coming for you. And in that moment, as the world seemed to close in around her, Sarah Jane knew that Red Hollow was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. The rain came down in sheets now, a cold, relentless curtain that plastered Sarah Jane Carter's hair to her face and soaked through her patched denim jacket, chilling her to the bone. Tied to the gnarled cottonwood tree on the lonely stretch of Cutler Road, half a mile from her family's ranch in Red Hollow, Nebraska. She shivered against the rough bark, the ropes around her wrists cutting deeper with every futile twist. The satellite phone pressed against her ear was her only lifeline, its faint glow flickering in the gathering dark as the storm clouds churned overhead. Ethan Holt's voice, steady and low, cut through the static and the roar of the rain. Sarah, you still with me? Talk to me, sweetheart. His words were a tether pulling her back from the edge of panic. I'm here, she whispered, her teeth chattering, her voice barely audible over the wind. It's cold, Ethan. It hurts. She heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, thousands of miles away in a classified location she could only imagine: a desert, a jungle, a place where men like him faced dangers she'd never understand. I know, Sarah. I'm on a transport now. 2 hours, maybe less. You're strong, you hear me? You're going to be okay. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a tightly coiled fury that made her heart ache with both fear and hope. Sarah clutched the phone tighter, the rain stinging her eyes, and tried to focus on his words, not the pain in her wrists or the weight of her fear. She didn't know how Ethan would cross an ocean to reach her, but she knew he would. He always did. Far from the windswept plains of Red Hollow, Ethan Holt sat in the belly of a military transport plane, the hum of the engines vibrating through the metal floor. His jaw was set, his broad shoulders tense under a plain black t-shirt, his calloused hands gripping the straps of his gear bag. Around him, his Navy SEAL team, 5 men he'd fought beside through missions too classified to name, sat in silence, their faces unreadable, but their eyes sharp, ready for whatever he needed. Ethan was their leader, a lieutenant, whose calm under fire had earned their trust in places where hesitation meant death. But this was different. This wasn't a mission for country or command. This was personal. His wife, his Sarah, was tied to a tree alone and scared because a pack of small-town bullies thought they could break her. The thought made his blood burn, a rage he kept locked tight behind a mask of control. He leaned forward, his headset crackling as he spoke to the pilot securing clearance for an emergency landing at a rural airstrip outside Lincoln. "We move fast," he told his team, his voice clipped. "No casualties, but we send a message. They don't touch her again." His second-in-command, a wiry man named Ruiz, nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We got you, Holt. What's the play?" Ethan's gaze hardened. "We get her safe, then we find them." The team didn't question him. They knew Ethan Holt didn't make threats, he made promises. Back in Red Hollow, the storm was worsening, lightning splitting the sky as Sarah Jane huddled against the cottonwood. The ropes were slick with rain, but no less tight, and her wrists were raw, the skin chafed and bleeding in places. She tried to focus on Ethan's voice, telling him about the bullies, about Mason Reed's cruel smirk, and Tara's mocking laugh about how she'd tried to stay invisible, but they'd found her anyway. "They hate me," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know why." Ethan's response was soft but firm. "They don't hate you, Sarah. They're small, and you're bigger than they'll ever be. They're going to learn that tonight." She wanted to believe him, but the fear was heavy, pressing down on her chest, like the storm itself. She thought of her parents, Tom and Lila, who'd be sitting down to dinner, now wondering why she wasn't home. They didn't know about Ethan. Didn't know their daughter had married a soldier 2 years ago at a roadside chapel just over the state line. That secret had kept Sarah sane through the long months of Ethan's deployments, his letters tucked under her pillow, his rare calls, a lifeline to a world beyond Red Hollow's dusty horizons. But now, tied to this tree, she wondered if keeping him a secret had been a mistake. If she'd told someone, anyone would Mason have dared to go this far? The story of Sarah and Ethan began 2 summers ago at a rodeo in Grand Island where the air smelled of popcorn and leather, and the lights glowed like fireflies against the night sky. Sarah was 15, helping her father sell raffle tickets for the Ranchers Association, her braids swinging as she moved through the crowd. Ethan, 23 and home on leave, was there with a buddy, his broad frame and quiet demeanor standing out among the rowdy locals. She'd bumped into him by the cotton candy stand, her apology stumbling out before she met his eyes, green, steady, and kind, in a way that made her breath catch. They'd talked for hours that night, about the stars, about her dream of becoming a veterinarian, about his love for the open road, and the music of Johnny Cash. He didn't laugh at her dreams or call her a kid. He listened, really listened, and when he smiled, it was like the world got a little brighter. By the end of the summer, they were inseparable, stealing moments in the shadow of hay bales or under the bleachers. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't with a ring, but with a promise. "I'll always come back for you, Sarah Jane." They'd married in secret, her in a sundress, him in his dress blues, the chapel's neon sign buzzing in the dusk. He'd shipped out the next day, and she'd returned to Red Hollow, her heart full, but her lips sealed. She was still a kid in the eyes of the town, but to Ethan, she was everything. Now, as the rain poured and the thunder rolled, Sarah clung to that memory, to the weight of the cheap silver band she wore on a chain under her shirt. The satellite phone's battery was low, the screen flickering, but Ethan's voice never wavered. "Tell me about the ranch," he said, keeping her talking, keeping her grounded. "What's the new calf like?" She forced a shaky laugh, describing the wobbly-legged calf she'd named Daisy, how it followed her like a puppy. But her words faltered as the wind howled the tree, creaking above her. "Ethan, what if they come back?" she whispered. His voice turned hard, a blade in the dark. "They won't get near you again. I swear it." She believed him, not because she understood the world of covert ops and elite soldiers, but because she knew Ethan. He was her anchor, her fire, and he was coming. Meanwhile, in Red Hollow, Mason, Reed, Tara, and Bryce were holed up at Dusty's Diner, the only place open past 8, in a town that rolled up its sidewalks at dusk. The neon sign buzzed outside, casting a red glow over their booth as they sipped milkshakes and laughed about their prank. Mason leaned back, his Letterman jacket slung over the seat, his blonde hair still perfect despite the rain. "She's probably crying her eyes out," he said, grinning. "Bet she's learned her place now." Tara giggled, twirling a straw between her manicured fingers. "God, did you see her face? Like a scared little mouse." Bryce, though, was quieter, his eyes on the window where the storm raged. "You sure we should have left her out there?" he asked, his voice low. "It's getting bad." Mason waved him off, his smirk unwavering. "She's fine. Probably untied herself by now. Let her walk home in the rain, it'll toughen her up." Bryce shifted uneasy, but didn't push back. He never did. They didn't know that a military transport was cutting through the night sky, carrying a man who'd faced down warlords and insurgents without flinching, and who now had a very personal mission. Back at the Carter Ranch, Tom and Lila were growing frantic. Sarah was never late, not without a call or a text. Lila paced the kitchen, her hands wringing a dish towel while Tom grabbed his truck keys. "She's probably at the library lost in a book," he said, but his voice was tight. They'd called her cell a cheap prepaid phone she rarely used, and gotten no answer. Lila's eyes were wet with worry. "Something's wrong, Tom. I feel it." They drove into town, the truck's headlights slicing through the rain, and stopped at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Danvers, a grizzled man with a penchant for dismissing teenage drama, leaned back in his chair. "Kids pull pranks, Lila. She'll turn up soaked and sulky." Tom's fists clenched, but he nodded, not wanting to waste time arguing. They didn't know about the cottonwood tree, or the ropes, or the call Sarah had made to a man who was already airborne. His team locked and loaded for a mission unlike any they'd faced before. Ethan's plane hit turbulence, the cabin rattling as he checked his watch. 90 minutes out. He closed his eyes, picturing Sarah, not the scared girl tied to a tree, but the one who'd laughed with him under the stars, who'd whispered her dreams of saving animals and seeing the world. That girl was why he fought, why he endured the things he couldn't tell her about. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Ruiz's. "We hit the ground running," he said. "She's waiting." Ruiz nodded, checking his gear. The team was in civilian clothes, jeans, flannels, ball caps pulled low, but their movements were precise, their silence heavy with purpose. They weren't just soldiers, they were SEALs trained to operate in shadows, and tonight, those shadows were falling on Red Hollow. Sarah's phone beeped, the low battery warning piercing the night. "Ethan, it's dying," she said, panic creeping back. "Stay with me," he said, his voice urgent now. "Sing to me, Sarah, that song you sang at the rodeo." She swallowed her throat dry and started humming. Ring of Fire, her voice shaky, but growing steadier with each note. The rain didn't let up, the lightning flashing closer, but she sang, and Ethan listened, his heart pounding as the plane descended. "I'm close, Sarah," he said. "1 hour. You're not alone." And as she sang, her voice a fragile thread in the storm, Sarah Jane Carter felt a spark of something new, not just fear, but defiance. She was more than the quiet girl they mocked. She was Ethan Holt's wife, and she would hold on until he came. The storm had turned the fields of Red Hollow, Nebraska, into a sea of mud and shadow, the rain pounding the earth as dawn broke in a faint gray haze over the horizon. Sarah Jane Carter stood shivering against the gnarled cottonwood tree on Cutler Road, her wrists raw and bleeding from the coarse ropes that bound her to the bark. The satellite phone in her hand was nearly dead, its screen flickering, as Ethan Holt's voice crackled through a lifeline in the chaos. "Sarah, I'm 20 minutes out," he said, his tone steady but laced with an urgency that made her heart race. "You're doing great. Just hold on." The rain stung her face, soaking her patched denim jacket, but his words kept her anchored even as the thunder roared and lightning lit up the lonely stretch of road. Sarah's mind churned, replaying the cruelty of Mason, Reed, Tara, and Bryce, the trio who'd ambushed her, tied her here, and left her to the storm with their laughter echoing in her ears. She wasn't just scared anymore. A spark of anger burned in her chest, a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. She was Sarah Jane Carter, wife of a Navy SEAL, and she was done being their victim. As the first hints of light crept through the clouds, she heard the distant rumble of an engine. Not the familiar growl of a pickup, but something heavier, purposeful. Headlights cut through the rain, and her breath caught. Ethan was here. Half a world away, just hours ago, Lieutenant Ethan Holt had been in a classified briefing, his Navy SEAL team preparing for a high-stakes extraction in a war zone he couldn't name. But when Sarah's call came through, everything else fell away. Now, as the black SUV roared down Cutler Road, Ethan was out before it stopped, his boots sinking into the mud. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, a ball cap pulled low, but his movements were pure SEAL, precise, and unyielding. His team, 5 men trained to face death without blinking, fanned out behind him, their silhouettes ghostly in the rain. Ethan's eyes locked on Sarah. Her small frame slumped against the tree, her braid dripping her face, pale but defiant. His heart clenched, rage and guilt warring within him. He'd been fighting for strangers while his wife suffered here alone. He ran to her, his combat knife flashing as he cut the ropes in one swift motion. They fell away, and Sarah collapsed into his arms, her body trembling, but her grip fierce. "You came," she whispered, her voice raw. "Always," he said, his throat tight as he held her, shielding her from the rain. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his green eyes scanning her face, her wrists, the red marks where the ropes had bitten deep. "You're safe now," he said, but his jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to the horizon. This wasn't over. Ethan helped Sarah into the SUV where Ruiz, his second-in-command, wrapped her in a thermal blanket. "Stay with her," Ethan told him, his voice low. Ruiz nodded, his dark eyes softening as he handed Sarah a bottle of water. "You're a tough kid," he said, and Sarah managed a weak smile. But Ethan's attention was elsewhere. He turned to his team, his voice clipped. "We find them. Now." The bullies, Mason, Tara, and Bryce, had no idea what they'd unleashed. Ethan's team had already tracked their likely location through a combination of local chatter and a quick hack of Mason's social media, where he'd boasted about teaching the cowgirl a lesson in a group chat. The trail led to an abandoned barn on the edge of town, a crumbling relic where kids often gathered to drink and dodge the sheriff's patrols. Ethan's team moved like shadows, piling back into the SUV and speeding through the rain-soaked streets of Red Hollow, the town still asleep under the storm. Inside the barn, Mason Reed lounged on a pile of old hay bales, a beer can in his hand, his Letterman jacket slung over his shoulder. Tara sat cross-legged beside him, scrolling through her phone, her laughter sharp as she replayed a video of Sarah struggling against the ropes. "Look at her squirm," she giggled, but her voice faltered when Bryce shifted uncomfortably, his eyes on the barn's creaking door. "This ain't right, Mason," he muttered, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "What if she's still out there?" "The storm's bad." Mason rolled his eyes, tossing the empty can into the dark. "Relax, Bryce. She's probably home by now, crying to her mommy. Nobody cares about Sarah Jane." He smirked, but there was a nervous edge to it, a crack in his bravado. The rain pounded the tin roof, drowning out the sound of tires on gravel outside. They didn't hear, the SUV didn't see the shadows moving through the storm until the barn door swung open with a crash, and Ethan Holt stepped into the dim light, his silhouette towering against the flickering glow of a lantern. Mason scrambled to his feet, his smirk gone, his blue eyes wide. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, but his voice cracked. Ethan didn't answer. Behind him, his team fanned out their presence, silent but suffocating, their faces unreadable in the half-light. Ethan stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his eyes locked on Mason. "You tied my wife to a tree," he said, his voice calm but laced with a menace that made Tara drop her phone. Mason laughed, a nervous barking sound. "Sarah Jane, that loser's your wife." "You're joking." Ethan didn't smile. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance, disarming Mason of the fresh beer can he'd grabbed, twisting his arm just enough to make him wince. "You should be scared," Ethan said softly, his face inches from Mason's. "You have no idea who I am." He released him, and Mason stumbled back, his bravado shattered. Tara was crying now, her hands shaking, and Bryce was muttering apologies, his voice barely audible. Ethan's team didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough a wall of silent threat that made the barn feel smaller, the air thicker. Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Here's how this works," he said, his eyes never leaving Mason's. "You're going to apologize to Sarah. You're going to mean it. And you're never going to speak to her again. If you do, I'll know. And I'll be back." Mason tried to puff out his chest to cling to the last scraps of his pride. "You don't scare me, man," he said, but his voice trembled. Ethan tilted his head, his gaze cold, and stepped closer, forcing Mason to back up until he hit the hay bales. "You don't get it," Ethan said. "This isn't a game. You hurt my wife, and there's nowhere you can hide from me." Tara sobbed louder, and Bryce raised his hands, his face pale. "We're sorry. Okay? It was just a prank." "We didn't mean," Ethan cut him off with a look. "You meant it," he said, "but you're going to fix it. Tomorrow you go to her house, you apologize to her face, and you pray she's more forgiving than I am." Back at the SUV, Sarah sat wrapped in the blanket, her hands clutching the water bottle, her body still trembling, but her eyes clearer now. Ruiz stayed with her, his voice gentle as he asked about the ranch, keeping her mind off the pain. She told him about Daisy, the calf she'd named, and how she wanted to save animals one day. But her thoughts kept drifting to Ethan, to what he was doing now. She didn't want blood, didn't want violence, but she wanted them to understand, to feel the weight of what they'd done. She glanced at Ruiz. "He won't hurt them, will he?" she asked. Ruiz's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Holt? Nah. He'll scare 'em so bad they'll never look at you again, but he's surgical. No mess." Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the silver band on the chain around her neck. She thought of the girl she'd been yesterday, the one who kept her head down, who let Mason's words cut her to pieces. That girl was still there, but she was changing, hardening, growing into someone new. Meanwhile, the town of Red Hollow was stirring. Sarah's parents, Tom and Lila, had spent the night searching their truck, crisscrossing the back roads, their worry turning to dread. They'd gone back to Sheriff Danvers, who'd finally agreed to send a deputy out. But the storm had slowed everything down. Word was spreading now, whispers of Sarah's absence rippling through the diner, the gas station, the church group that met at dawn. No one knew about the cottonwood tree or the Navy SEAL who'd landed in their midst, but they felt something, a shift in the air, like the storm had brought more than rain. At the barn, Ethan's team was wrapping up. They hadn't laid a hand on the bullies beyond Ethan's brief hold on Mason, but the message was clear. Mason sat on the hay bales, his face pale, his hands shaking. Tara was curled up, her mascara streaked, and Bryce looked like he wanted to disappear. Ethan crouched down, his voice low. "You're lucky she's stronger than you," he said. "But if you ever come near her again, you won't be." He stood his team falling in behind him, and they left the barn without another word, the door slamming shut in their wake. Ethan returned to the SUV, his face softening as he saw Sarah. He slid in beside her, pulling her close, his warmth cutting through the chill that clung to her. "It's done," he said. "They'll come to you tomorrow. They'll apologize." Sarah nodded her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She didn't ask what he'd said, what he'd done. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as the quiet ranch girl, but as someone who could stand tall. The storm was easing now, the rain softening to a drizzle, the sky lightening over Red Hollow. But the town wasn't the same, and neither was Sarah. As Ethan's team drove her back to the ranch, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds, she felt the weight of her silence lifting, replaced by a fire she hadn't known she carried. Red Hollow would remember this day, and so would she. The dawn had broken over Red Hollow, Nebraska, painting the plains in soft golds and pinks, the storm's last clouds drifting away like ghosts. Sarah Jane Carter stood on the porch of her family's weathered ranch house, the air crisp with the scent of wet grass and cattle. Her wrists still bore the faint red marks of the ropes that had bound her to the cottonwood tree, but the pain was dull now, overshadowed by a quiet strength growing inside her. Ethan Holt. Her Navy SEAL husband stood beside her, his broad frame steady in jeans and a flannel shirt, his green eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. The events of the previous night. The ambush by Mason, Reed, Tara, and Bryce, the harrowing hours tied to the tree. Ethan's lightning-fast arrival with his elite team had shaken Red Hollow to its core. The town was buzzing, rumors spreading like wildfire through the diner, the feed store, the church pews. Sarah Jane, the quiet ranch girl, wasn't so quiet anymore. She was something else now, something the town couldn't quite name, and as she leaned against Ethan, his arm warm around her shoulders, she felt the weight of her old self falling away. This was a new dawn, not just for Red Hollow, but for her. The morning after Ethan's confrontation at the barn, Mason, Tara, and Bryce showed up at the Carter Ranch, their faces pale, their eyes downcast. Sarah's parents, Tom and Lila, watched from the porch, their confusion evident as the three teenagers shuffled up the gravel drive. Mason, usually all swagger and smirks, looked smaller without his letterman jacket, his blonde hair disheveled, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're sorry, Sarah," he said, his words tilted but heavy with something that might have been shame. "What we did, it was wrong. It won't happen again." Tara, her mascara smudged, mumbled an apology, her hands twisting nervously, while Bryce, the quietest of the trio, met Sarah's eyes for a fleeting moment, his own filled with regret. "We didn't know," he said softly. "We're sorry." Sarah stood tall, her braids swinging gently, her chin lifted. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at them, her gaze steady in a way it had never been before. Ethan stood behind her, his arms crossed, his presence a silent warning. The bullies didn't linger. They turned and left their footsteps quick, as if the weight of Ethan's stare was too much to bear. Tom and Lila exchanged glances, their worry now mixed with questions they didn't yet know how to ask. Sarah knew the time for secrets was over, but first she had to face the town. Red Hollow High was different when Sarah returned on Monday. The hallways, once a gauntlet of whispers and snickers, were quieter, now the students watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Mason's usual crowd parted as she walked to her locker, their eyes avoiding hers. Tara kept her distance, her laughter replaced by a nervous fidgeting, while Bryce offered a small nod, almost respectful, before hurrying away. The story of what had happened was already legend-twisted and exaggerated. In the telling, Sarah's mysterious husband, a soldier, or maybe a spy, had stormed into town with a team of commandos, terrifying the bullies into submission. Some said he'd tied Mason to the same tree, others that he'd chased them through the storm with a gun. The truth was simpler, but no less powerful, and Sarah let the rumors swirl. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. At lunch, she sat alone as always, but this time a few classmates lingered nearby, their glances less mocking, more curious. A girl from her biology class, Emily, slid onto the bench across from her, offering a shy smile. "You okay, Sarah?" she asked. Sarah nodded, surprised by the warmth in her chest. "Yeah," she said, "I'm okay." It was the truth, and it felt like a victory. Ethan stayed in Red Hollow for 2 weeks, taking leave to help at the ranch and be with Sarah. He rose before dawn with Tom mending fences and hauling feed, his strength and quiet competence, earning her father's grudging respect. Lila, still reeling from the revelation of Sarah's secret marriage, watched him closely, her maternal instincts warring with her need to understand. One evening, as the family sat around the kitchen table, the air heavy with unspoken questions, Sarah took a deep breath and told them everything. She spoke of the rodeo where she'd met Ethan, their whirlwind summer, the secret wedding in the chapel with its flickering neon sign. She pulled the silver band from the chain around her neck, holding it up like a talisman. "I love him," she said, her voice steady. "And he loves me." Tom's face was a storm of emotions, anger, hurt, but also a flicker of pride. Lila reached for Sarah's hand, her eyes wet. "Why didn't you tell us, baby?" she asked. Sarah swallowed her gaze, flicking to Ethan, who sat quietly letting her lead. "I was scared you wouldn't understand," she said. "But I'm not scared anymore." The conversation stretched late into the night, raw and painful, but healing, a bridge built between the girl Sarah had been and the woman she was becoming. During those weeks, Ethan taught Sarah more than just how to mend fences. In the barn, under the glow of a single bulb, he showed her basic self-defense, how to break a hold, how to stand her ground, how to use her small frame to her advantage. His hands were gentle but firm, guiding her through the moves, his voice calm but insistent. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah Jane," he said, stepping back as she practiced a strike, her fist cutting through the air. She felt the truth of it in her bones, a strength that had always been there, buried under years of silence and shame. They spent evenings under the stars, sitting on the tailgate of Tom's truck, sharing stories of their 2 years apart. Ethan told her about the places he'd been, not the missions which were classified, but the small things, the way the desert sky burned red at dusk, the sound of waves in a far-off ocean. Sarah told him about the ranch, about Daisy the calf, about her dream of veterinary school. "You'll get there," he said, his hand squeezing hers, "and I'll be cheering you on." She believed him not just because he was Ethan, but because she was starting to believe in herself. The town, too, was changing. Mason Reed's star had fallen. The quarterback who'd once ruled Red Hollow High was now a cautionary tale. His coach benched him for the next game, citing conduct unbecoming, and his friends drifted away, their loyalty eroded by the whispers of his cruelty. Tara kept her head down, her social media silent, while Bryce started sitting alone at lunch, his guilt a visible weight. Sheriff Danvers, embarrassed by his initial dismissal of Sarah's disappearance, made a point of checking in with the Carters, his gruff apologies a sign of the town's shifting perspective. People who'd once ignored Sarah now nodded to her at the feed store, their eyes holding a new respect. The cottonwood tree on Cutler Road, once a symbol of her humiliation, became something else, a marker of her survival, its scarred bark a testament to her resilience. Sarah visited it one afternoon alone, running her fingers over the rough trunk. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. It was just a tree, and she was more than the girl who'd been tied to it. Ethan's leave ended too soon, the call of duty pulling him back to a world Sarah couldn't follow. They stood on the porch the morning he left, the sun rising over the plains, the air cool and quiet. He held her close, his lips brushing her forehead. "I'm always one call away," he said, echoing the promise he'd made when they married. Sarah knotted her throat tight, but she didn't cry. She'd cried enough. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "And I'll be okay." He smiled, his eyes soft with pride, and handed her a new satellite phone, fully charged, its number programmed with his. "Just in case," he said. She watched his SUV disappear down the gravel road, the dust rising like a farewell, but she didn't feel alone. Ethan was out there, and she was here, stronger than she'd ever been. In the weeks that followed, Sarah Jane Carter became a quiet force in Red Hollow. She spoke up in class, her answers clear and confident, her hand raised without hesitation. She joined the veterinary club at school, her passion for animals no longer a secret she hid behind books. When Mason passed her in the hall, he looked away, his shoulders hunched, and Sarah didn't flinch. One day she stopped him, her voice calm but firm. "I forgive you," she said, not because she wanted to, but because she could. "But don't think I'll forget." Mason nodded, his face flushed, and walked away. It wasn't revenge, it was power, the kind that came from knowing who she was. Red Hollow learned a lesson it would never forget: never underestimate the quiet ones. They might have a Navy SEAL husband, a fire in their heart, and a strength that no storm could extinguish. Sarah Jane Carter stood on the ranch porch, the silver band back on her chain, her eyes on the horizon. The world was bigger now, and she was ready to meet it.